We're just going to go over a little bit of information about the classical Americas civilizations you read about. And I want to show you some pictures so you can better visualize some of the things you read about. And then we're also going to label them all on the map. So the first one was the Moche. If you look at the map, the Moche are the very dark black part that's shaded in on the map of South America. So they're along the coast of the Pacific in what is today Peru. So go ahead and shade that in. You can also see here some of the ruins from the Moche. So you read about how they had stepped pyramids for religious ceremonies, and you can see the ruins of one of those in the top right corner. You can also see some of the artwork that was dedicated to the gods of the temple that you read about. The next one is Teotihuacan. Teotihuacan was a very important city, a very large city, one of the largest in the Americas during its time period, and it was a very important religious site. So much so that even later civilizations in the Americas came and worshipped here. So here you have a picture of the ruins of the city, and you can see the different pyramids where some of the temples would have been. Go ahead and label Teotihuacan. It's just one city, and you can see it's very near where Mexico City is today. The next one are the Mayas. The Mayas are the kind of medium gray shaded area in Central America, so it includes part of Mexico and Guatemala and covering the Yucatan Peninsula. So go ahead and shade that in and label it Mayas. Some of the things you read about were the religious temples. Again, you can see a lot of these civilizations have similar architecture, which makes sense because there was cultural diffusion and trade within the Americas. And remember, these are examples of monumental architecture, and we've talked in the past about how that often is directly related to religion, which these are. Another thing you read about was terraced farming. So if you look at the picture in the top right, it shows you an example of terraced farming. Because they lived in mountainous areas, they carved kind of steps into the mountain so that they could farm on the flatter areas. This also would help decrease soil erosion, because if they're just trying to farm on the slanted part of the mountain, whenever it rains, the soil and everything will just run right down. And so this kind of breaks it up and helps prevent some of those issues. And then the other picture you see is the Maya pictograph writing. So the Mayas had a very sophisticated writing system, and like some of the other early civilizations we looked at, they used a pictograph system where they had symbols for each word rather than an alphabet like we have today. The next one you read about are the Pueblos. The Pueblos are located in what is today the Southwest United States. So go ahead and shade that region in. The question says, what would be the environmental challenges of farming in this region? And so if you think about what you know about places like New Mexico and Arizona, it's very hot and dry. And so that would really present challenges to being a farmer in that region, and it forced the Pueblo Native Americans to have to develop more sophisticated irrigation to make the most of what little water they had. Some other things that you read about: the Pueblo Indians adapted varieties of maize, squash, and beans to their climate. Another thing that's significant is their homes. So they sometimes lived in pit homes, like the ones you see in the ruins in the bottom picture, where they actually carved out of the ground their homes. They also used adobe, which is kind of sun-dried mud bricks, which is what you see in the top right picture. The last group are the Mound Builders. So they have many names. Sometimes they're referred to as the Hopewell Indians or the Mississippian, but we're going to, for our purposes, kind of put them all together as one big group. There were a lot of different tribes and groups within this region, but for the purposes of this class, you don't necessarily need to know those individual groups. So they are on the eastern United States, so mostly east of the Mississippi River. They also grew maize, beans, and squash. One of their major cities was Cahokia, which is in present-day Illinois. Some of the things you read about, they had a socially stratified society, so they had distinct social classes. They're polytheistic, which is a commonality to all of these American civilizations. They traded with other civilizations in Mexico. So we have evidence of resources being traded between these different civilizations, and that would have resulted in cultural diffusion. Now, if you look at these pictures of Cahokia, these are on the far right are illustrations of what Cahokia would have looked like. Now, we can tell from these that they had a strong government and also that they were really good at agriculture. So if you look at the bottom picture, the city looks pretty well organized. And we talked about this with the Indus River civilization, how when we see evidence of a very organized city, we know they would have had to have a strong government to control where people were building and direct people to build in a certain way. With Cahokia, we also know that they would have had to be really good at agriculture. That's because when you have a bunch of people in a city, not all of those people, they're not going to be farming on their own, right? They're going to have other jobs. They're going to work for the government or work for the priests or be artisans producing products. And so they're not actually growing food themselves necessarily. That means you have to have people surrounding the city that are growing so much food that it can support all the people in the city. And we've talked about that before when we studied the Neolithic Revolution, but that's just important to keep in mind. And then the final picture is a picture of what the mounds look like today. So if you would go to visit Illinois, you can see these today. And historians don't know for sure what they were used for, but they definitely would have had some kind of religious purpose. So we don't know if they were associated with burials or sacrifices or other religious ceremonies, but they're definitely an example of monumental architecture that's related to religion.